Good evening. Go ahead and turn to Isaiah chapter 58. That's where we're going to spend most of our time this evening. Isaiah chapter 58. As you can see, the slide says, "Have we deprived ourselves of fasting?" We're going to be looking this evening at how fasting is talked about in the Bible as a tool we can use to aid our devotion to God. In my experience, fasting isn't something that we talk about a whole lot as Christians. There are probably several people here who fasted occasionally, but if you haven't thought about fasting before, this is your invitation to do so. Jordan just read Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 through 18, where Jesus says, when you fast, do it this way. He says, when you fast. I think that suggests pretty strongly there's something we can learn from fasting. And Matthew chapter 6 isn't the only time that Jesus talks about fasting. He talks about this quite a lot. So do his apostles, especially Paul. And the Old Testament is filled with examples and many commands as well about fasting. Fasting is very present in the Bible today. So why isn't it really talked about today? Well, one reason may be that fasting developed a sort of bad reputation because of these different ascetic practices in the Middle Ages. There were basically individuals or even groups of people who would go around torturing their bodies, depriving themselves of food, and saying, I'm way holier than you people who are indulging yourselves by eating food. And that's definitely extreme. Those people weren't listening to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6. So that might be one reason. Another one is, this is true for me, is it touches upon a matter that is very personal to all of us, which is food, which is what we eat. We live in a world, and maybe we can say especially a city, where we have abundant and particularly various and wonderful food that we can readily have access to. Everyone obviously needs food, but you look around, or you can think about yourself or other people, and you can tell that people also have food to relax or even to counteract anxiety or boredom. Our culture tells us to get food quickly and get it the way that you want it. But tonight, as we're looking at Isaiah chapter 58, I want to think with you about some powerful applications that we can gain by thinking about fasting. And I really do believe it is invaluable in regard to the spiritual and mental discipline and for our understanding deeper our relationship with God and even our relationship with each other. So, without further ado, we're going to read from Isaiah 58. And this evening, we're going to start looking verses 1 through 5, which is Isaiah's critique of the false fasting the Israelites are trying to impress God with. And then we're going to look at what God originally commanded concerning fasting and talk about why the Israelites should have known the right way to do this. Then finally, we'll make some applications from all these ideas. So Isaiah 58, verses 1 through 5. You can follow along in your Bibles, listen, or read on screen. Isaiah says, cry aloud, do not hold back. Lift up your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their transgression, to the house of Jacob their sins. Yet they seek me daily and delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that did righteousness and did not forsake the judgments of their God. They ask of me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God. Why have we fasted and you haven't seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you take no notice of it? And God says, behold, in the day of your fast, you seek your own pleasure. You oppress all your workers. Behold, you fast only to quarrel, to fight, to hit with a wicked fist. Fasting like yours this day will not make your voice to be heard on high. Is this such a fast that I choose? A day for a person to humble himself? Is it to bow down his head like a reed and to spread sackcloth and ashes under him? Will you call this a fast? Will you call this a day acceptable to the Lord? We can see here the people are in shock that God is not responding to their fervent cries for help. They're crying out for his presence and God is not answering. And on the surface, it may seem like they're doing everything right, everything that they should be. They're humiliating themselves and afflicting themselves through fasting. They're wearing sackcloth. They're throwing ashes all over themselves. And they're doing all these things, but God isn't answering them, right? And they're really confused. They're saying, why don't you hear what we're saying? Why don't you see what we're doing? But look at the highlighted part, verses 3 and 4. God says, in the day of your fast, you seek your own pleasures. You're oppressing your workers. In verse 4, behold, your fast is only to fight and to hit each other with a wicked fist. So it's clear, it is clear what the problem is. Is while their fasting looks right, they're breaking a host of other commands from God. The people have taken themselves to a place where they don't recognize this is a problem. But Isaiah says, you should know not to do this. You should know this is a practice that is not acceptable to the Lord. God doesn't want you to fast this way. They're on the outside, it looks like they're doing fine, but when you look close, it's clear. When you look inside, it's clear that their hearts are not in the right place. When Jesus talks to people who are behaving similarly, Pharisees, he calls them whitewashed tombs because of this horrible, hypocritical kind of behavior. In the second half of Isaiah, we'll also see they're basically treating fasting like a substitute. If we fast, if we do this part fine, we can basically do whatever else we want. And God's not being fooled by that. Isaiah is desperately trying to wake them up to that. In the second half of the chapter, Isaiah is going to clearly communicate what the true fast looks like. But before we move on, we're going to take a couple minutes to look at God's original commands and why the Israelites should have known that fasting was not a substitute for God's other commands. Rather, it's a practice to strengthen devotion to God and his law. Because if an Israelite knows the right way to fast, then he certainly has no excuse to forget God's other commands. Notably, like Isaiah says, not to oppress your workers, not to fight, not to abuse. And I think we can go a step further, though. We can say that if we look back at God's original commands concerning fasting, we'll find it's not some strange ritual that has nothing to do with the rest of God's commands, but something closely linked with the rest of God's commands. So, fasting, just the plain term, means you don't have food for a period of time. We all know that. You don't have food, but you can have water. That's fasting simply. In the Bible, we also see sometimes there's a partial kind of fast. Daniel chapter 10 is an example of that, where Daniel says he's deprived himself of pleasurable kinds of foods. And on very rare occasions, we see an absolute sort of fast. It looks like for a lengthy period of time, there's no food and maybe not even water, as we can see in the cases of Jonah and Esther. Normally is done for one day, from sunrise to sunset. And that's just a couple examples there. You look at Judges or different passages in Samuel. And more rarely, we see it done for several days. Like I mentioned, Esther is 3 days. We see several times in Samuel and Chronicles where it's done for 7 days, very dramatic occasions. And extremely rarely we see it done for 40 days. I think we only read about Moses, Elijah, and Jesus fasting in such a way. But normally, for one day, sunrise to sunset. The most common type of fasting we see in the Bible is what might best be described as spontaneous fasting. People often fasted without specific commandments during times of distress. Sometimes we see that being done as a big group of people, and sometimes as an individual act. There's several occasions where people fast when war is coming or when they're in the middle of war. David fasts when his son is very sick. Um, it goes along, of course, with his desperate prayers to God in that horrible situation. And then we see several occasions when beloved people died. Verses on screen talk about when Saul and Jonathan met their end against the Philistines. People fasted when they were mourning for those people. This is the most important part to remember is people fasted when they were praying for forgiveness. Moses fasted for Israel. Nineveh fasted for themselves when Jonah told them God was angry with them. Daniel fasted for Israel, and Nehemiah chapter 9 describes one occasion where Israel is led to fast for themselves when they're brought to awareness of their own sinfulness. And we see a couple occasions where people fast in response to a general kind of danger. The Edomites are coming, we should fast and pray. And Ezra fasts before taking a dangerous road from Babylon back to the land of Judah, returning from exile. So they fasted during war and times of trouble. They fasted for their sick loved ones when those people died. And again, most importantly, they fasted when they were praying for forgiveness. And we can see every time fasting is for a spiritual purpose, and it's paired with prayer. And that makes a lot of sense because prayer is reaching out to God and communicating with Him, seeking His guidance or help. But what we see in just about every one of these examples is that fasting was a tool to help a person fervently pray. Because it's one thing to say, as the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you, O God. And that's a beautiful sentiment. But sometimes we see people taking things a step further. And they show themselves how seriously they need God by literally hungering after His word and His righteousness rather than hungering after physical bread. So when we reflect on spontaneous fasting, I think it's abundantly clear that this deprivation of food was meant to remind whoever did it that they were entirely dependent on God. It was a reminder that you need blessings from the one who gives you all your physical and spiritual sustenance. And you remove food from yourself to show God you believe He's more important than even fundamental physical needs. And that's why we see people spontaneously fasting. The other kind of fasting we see in the Bible is what we might call a designated fast. A time God commanded the people to do this as they're going around the calendar. The Jews would later create a lot of special occasions for fasting, but the only one described and commanded in the Old Testament is the Day of Atonement. I'd like to read just a couple of verses relating to this in Leviticus chapter 16. It's on screen, of course. You can turn there, 16, beginning in verse 29, if you'd like to. And this is what God says to Moses. This, the Day of Atonement, is to be a perpetual statute for you. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you must humble yourselves and do no work of any kind, both the native citizen and the resident foreigner who's among you. For this is the Day of Atonement. It's when atonement is to be made for you to cleanse you from all your sins. You must be clean before the Lord. It is to be a Sabbath of complete rest for you. And you must humble yourselves. It is a perpetual statute. Moses mostly describes the rules for priests and sacrifices during this chapter for the observance of the Day of Atoning for the people's sins. But also on this special day, they would observe every 7 years, the common Israelites had a command to follow as well. And that is the perpetual command for a complete Sabbath, a complete rest. The phrase humble yourselves or afflict yourselves or deprive yourselves, it means fasting. And this fasting was accompanied, of course, by prayer. It was an indication that the person fasting and praying regarded their need to seek God and his forgiveness as greater and more pressing than the need to eat. And refraining from work reflected that same sense of priority. I think we should also notice that the Sabbath is mentioned here. The rest from work is paired with the rest from eating. And the way the Sabbath is described here is right in line with the way it's described in the general commands Moses receives from God. Just going to reference a couple of verses here. Is in Exodus 16, verse 23, Moses instructed the people to bake and boil enough food on Friday for that evening and for the next day, the Sabbath. And that's because they weren't permitted to do that sort of work and that kind of meal preparation on the Sabbath day itself. And that fits with what we read later in Exodus chapter 35, where Moses says, "Don't even light a cooking fire in your house on the Sabbath day." So, the regular Sabbath did not strictly require fasting, but notice this. The time-consuming work required by ancient food preparation was freed up for them. And that really is a big deal, because during the week, people could easily spend a couple hours grinding away at grains or boiling meats. And we take it for granted, but cooking obviously wasn't as quick for them. It took longer to reach high temperatures. They didn't have powerful electronic appliances. And they certainly couldn't order delivery, right? So fasting, even the Sabbath, which Isaiah rather, is going to mention later in Isaiah 58, are both tools that people ought to have known how to use to draw closer to God. And their issue isn't fasting itself, but the selfish cruelty that they did along with it. In contrast, it's really clear God meant fasting to do the following sorts of things: to give a time of rest from regular duties, and to use that to draw near to God through prayer, and to use rest to devote yourself to helping others. The people know this, or they really, really should have known this. But they ignored God's commands, and that's why he's ignoring their fastings and their false prayers and their false Sabbaths. God's going to spell out really clearly what he wants from them in Isaiah 58, verses 6 through 14. And I think we'll go ahead and read that right now. This is what Isaiah says about the true fast, what God really wants from the people. So we'll begin reading here in verse 6 of Isaiah 58. This is what he says: "Is not this the fast that I would choose instead? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh, your own kindred? If you do this, then your light shall break forth like the dawn, your healing shall spring up speedily, your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer you. You shall cry, and he will say, 'Here I am.' If you take away the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger, the speaking of wickedness, if you pour yourselves out for the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then shall your light rise in the darkness, and your gloom will become as the noonday. And the Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your desire in the scorched places, make your bones strong. And you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. Your ancient ruins will be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in. If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and if instead you call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going after your own ways, or seeking after your own pleasure, or talking idly, then you shall take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth. I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. God makes it extremely clear that the fast he desires is not some substitute to replace his other commands. Rather, as we've discussed, fasting is meant to strengthen the child of God and to make him aware of God and also of God's commandments and his desires. In verse 6, God says the fast that he chooses is to loose the bonds of wickedness. And he goes on to describe how his people are to undo oppression, to feed the hungry, and to do good as he has always done good. And you know, among the commands Moses gave to the people relating to fasting, there was also this repeated series of commands. And that was that the Israelites had a responsibility to protect the sojourner, the widow, and the orphan, to do good to them, to provide for them. And God says it's because he did good to them, and he provided for them when they were still desperate and helpless slaves in Egypt. God says that when they do this, they're going to be like the dawn. They're going to be healing light for themselves and to other people. He says in verse 9, you'll cry out, and then God will say, here I am. And that's the whole issue that people have been complaining about since the beginning of the chapter. We've been fasting all this time, and you haven't heard us, you haven't seen us. Well, here's the solution, Israelites. Actually do what God said. And even do what God said to a greater extent than you've ever done it before. Because God is asking a lot from them. It says, if you pour yourselves out for the hungry, if you satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then God will provide for you continually. You won't be parched, you won't be scorched, and he will bless you. If you present yourself to him as a tool that he can use to rebuild ancient ruins and repair broken and dejected people, that is the fast the Lord requires. Fasting was meant to strengthen resolve for God's commands, not to replace them, not to be some weak substitute. Fasting was, in fact, an invitation to make further sacrifices for others. It was not an excuse for indulgence. God doesn't want his people to fear graciously giving. He promises that he will provide for the people who have a generous heart. And there's no scarcity with God. He can provide for all his people. One of the things that is perhaps the most important that God says is this idea of be a blessing, and then you'll be able to draw near to God. They desperately wanted God's presence. And the way you get to God's presence is by truly drawing near to him. Truly draw near to God. And you do that by reflecting and appreciating his heart, who he is. And that is always going to inspire us to be generous and to be kind to those who are around us. You can't separate those things. You cannot. I don't have a slide for this passage, but it's Exodus 31, beginning in verse 12, if you'd like to follow along or just listen closely. Exodus 31, beginning in verse 12. God says to Moses, tell the Israelites, surely you must keep my Sabbaths, for it's a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I'm the Lord who sanctifies you. So you must keep the Sabbath. It's holy to you. Everyone who defies it must surely be put to death. Indeed, if anyone does any work on it, then that person will be cut off from among the people. 6 days, work is to be done. But on the seventh day, it is a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Anyone who does work on the Sabbath day must surely be put to death. The Israelites must keep the Sabbath by observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the Israelites forever. For in 6 days the Lord created the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. God worked creation in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. And he didn't rest because he was weary, and he didn't rest because he wanted to be idle. I think we can safely say that he rested because he wanted to spend time with his creation. And I think we see the Sabbath as sort of like the other side of the coin. This is the time man rests with his creator. The rest of the week, God recognizes there's necessary work to be done to provide for yourself. But on the seventh day, you organize your life so that the day is free from those regular responsibilities. And what we just read in Isaiah makes it clear that it's not a freedom for idleness. That when you fast, in conjunction with the Sabbath or not, it needs to be done with a view toward being godly. Both these practices, again, practices that often go hand in hand, they remind us of our dependence on God. And if we truly appreciate our dependence on God, then we will do our best to extend his blessings to other people, right? Isaiah is saying, if you really appreciate what God's done for you, if you really want a relationship with God, go out and bless other people. That's how you draw near to God. And don't fear being dramatically generous, because God will provide. There's no scarcity with him. You see, Isaiah is emphasizing over and over that fasting ought to go hand in hand with such obvious acts of good. It's a tool for holiness. As we just read, this reflects divine rest. God rested with his people, so there's no more appropriate day. And Jesus is going to really unpack this later. There's no more appropriate day to serve and love other people than the Sabbath day. So here we are wrapping up. If I had to guess, I'd say you can understand how all that Isaiah says to the ancient Israelites is still relevant for us today. But I want to take a step back. Let's consider some precise applications we can take from Isaiah, what he says about fasting, and even what he says about the Sabbath in connection with it. In Romans chapter 14, verse 5, Paul says, one person may esteem one day as better than another, while another says all days are basically alike. But Paul says the one who observes the special day does it to honor the Lord, and the one who sees all days alike is also using each day for God. There'd certainly be no harm in adding a Sabbath observance to your calendar, but you don't have to do it. Whatever you do, though, Paul says, do it for God. It's interesting and true what people often say that 9 out of the 10 commandments are still applicable to us today. The Sabbath is the odd one out, and that's because it's the only ritual command among those. But we should remember Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, and he talked about his disciples fasting in Matthew chapter 6. There are a lot of applications with the Sabbath and with the fasting that so often went along with it. You certainly don't have to practice the Sabbath. I'm not even going to tell you necessarily have to fast. I'm certainly not going to tell you when you should fast. But we should all remember the one who fasts does it to the Lord. The one who eats also does it to the Lord, right? Every good and perfect thing comes from God. So feasting certainly isn't to be held in disdain. We can please God fasting or feasting. So that's the really important thing to remember here. Second point as we're wrapping up is 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 5. You can go back later and read that passage, but the summary is that Paul is giving commands to husbands and wives. He tells them not to deprive one another. He says, husband, your body belongs to your wife, so act like it. And he turns around and says to wives, your body belongs to your husband, so act like it. But in verse 5, he says something very interesting. He says, if the two of you agree, you can separate from that kind of intimacy for a time. Paul is talking about fasting. It's not like the fasting we read about over and over in the Old Testament. It's not a fast from food, but it certainly is a laying aside of something you would normally do so you can focus more on prayer. You agree together to deprive yourselves of that kind of intimacy for a time to dedicate yourself to God in a special way. And the point is that fasting is not limited to food. If you want to fast with food, that's great. You should do it as often as it would be helpful for you. But it is different from the Israelites fasting from food, because we already talked about how cutting food and food preparation out from their schedules was huge. It was very dramatically opened up their schedules because food preparation, working on the farm, all that was a huge time commitment. We live in a pretty different kind of society. We're in a world of pressure cookers, fast food, delivery. So fasting is still going to be good if you decide to pursue that, but it's certainly not exactly the same. What I would encourage you to do is to look at what things are dominating your life and consider if there are occasions when you can take a Sabbath rest from that. When you can fast and deprive yourself of different responsibilities, or maybe we can especially say fast from pleasures that you would normally participate in. I've found at different times in my life it's been very helpful to, frankly, fast from YouTube, different video games, different books. There's nothing wrong with any of those things, but those kinds of pleasures we often pursue in our free time are good to sacrifice on different occasions for different lengths of time. I'm not going to tell you what to take a rest from, what to deprive yourself of, and certainly not when to do it. But do remember, Jesus says, when you fast, something Jesus expected his people to be doing. It's something we see the early church doing quite often. It's something God's people seem to have always done. Here's the very last thing. I'm going to read in Matthew chapter 14. If you want to turn or listen to Matthew 14, beginning in verse 13. Or, sorry, Matthew 14, beginning in verse 12. And John's disciples came, took John's body, and buried it, and then they went and told Jesus. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore and saw a great crowd, he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. And from that, we see Jesus is going to feed the 5,000 on that occasion. But what I want to notice with you here in conclusion is that Jesus had gone away to pray by himself in response to his cousin John being killed. It seemed to have troubled him a great deal. John was a family member, and maybe beyond that, John was a righteous man killed because he was righteous. And that had to have reminded Jesus of his upcoming crucifixion. We know from reading about Jesus in the garden that was deeply troubling for him. So Jesus is going off to pray by himself, but the crowds find him, and Jesus lets himself be interrupted. Jesus had these plans, he had these very good plans, but he was willing to compromise to help other people. And he provided a feast for these people by postponing his personal time of rest. And catch this. If Jesus was willing to postpone prayer with God, we should certainly take a cue from Isaiah 58 and be willing, very willing, to interrupt ourselves from things that are certainly much less important. Fasting is a tool of devotion soundly built upon principles of humility and self-sacrifice. And when we lay our desires, dreams, and ultimately our very selves on the altar to Christ so that we can love others as he did, I believe that we will learn more and more why Jesus calls himself the Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus has promised rest and joy to everyone who believes in his name and obeys him. So if you need to surrender your life to Him by being baptized, or if we can support you and help you with prayer or in any way, then do please come forward as together we stand and sing this invitation song.